Diabetes Connections is brought to you by the only ultra-rapid-acting inhaled insulin and by Dexcom, keeping you in control with an integrated system for diabetes management.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Welcome to another week of the show. I am always so glad to have you here. You know we aim to educate and inspire with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and this week I don't have an interview for you. Instead, I want to share an excerpt from Still the World's Worst Diabetes Mom, More Real-Life Stories of Parenting a Child with Type 1 Diabetes. That is my new book. It is out today if you're listening when this episode goes live, November 1st, 2022. And it's available on Amazon and Target and wherever you get your books online. It's out in paperback and in Kindle or ebook. The audiobook will be out in a couple of weeks. Sorry about that. It lagged behind last time, and we've got a couple of weeks apparently to wait until it's out on Audible. If you're familiar with my first book, you know that I think mistakes are a parent's secret superpower. I learn everything from messing it up the first time, even with diabetes. And in the second book, I wanted to talk about how, teaching your kids and teaching your family that not being perfect, but instead aiming for safe and happy is a philosophy that really pays off. My son was diagnosed right before he turned 2. He is about to turn 18. And I think this philosophy has served us very well as he moves toward independence as a young adult. So I wanted you to have a little taste of what's in the book. Yes, there's lots of mistakes and funny stories and mishaps and me doing things wrong and Benny kind of rolling his eyes and laughing at me. But there's a little bit more kind of been there mom level advice in this book. For example, this chapter is all about conversations I think everybody should have before deciding whether and how to use a CGM. Now, of course, Dexcom, Libre, Medtronic, CGMs are pretty much becoming standard of care for those who can afford them. But I do think there's still a lot to consider here. Thinking this out can make your child's use of CGM much more effective and with a lot less stress. And if you're an adult who's considering sharing with somebody else, I think these are questions that you might want to think through. Yes, it's aimed at parents of kids with type 1, but I have been told by some adults with type 1 that they can learn from these conversations as well. This chapter follows one all about our CGM timeline. I don't want to retell that whole story here, but I do think it's good to have some perspective. Benny started using the Dexcom at age 9. It was the G4 Platinum Pediatric, and that was back in 2013. And I say that because not having one for 7 years after his diagnosis has to have influenced how I feel about using one now. You should also know that each chapter in Still the World's Worst Diabetes Mom ends with an Ask Your Doctor list of suggestions, and you will hear that at the end of this chapter as well. Oh, and make sure to listen through to the end. I've got a contest and a giveaway. Conversations around CGM. Around the same time the G6 came out, I noticed something interesting in my local parent group. No longer waiting weeks or months to start CGM, children were being diagnosed with T1D and sent home from the hospital with a Dexcom. Charlotte, North Carolina was one of the pilot programs for early CGM adoption in newly diagnosed kids. How did we find out about the new program? Well, there wasn't an announcement. Instead, we suddenly started seeing basic questions in our group that hadn't come up before. Questions like, what do the arrows mean? Can my child shower with the Dexcom on? And can my child sleep with the Dexcom on? There was also a lot of panic about troubleshooting Dexcom issues and with not knowing how to perform fingerstick blood glucose checks. We quickly figured out something had changed. It seemed the Dexcom education was coming on top of the already incredibly info-dense diabetes education. The two together made for some very confusing times. My group was more than happy to help, but I think this issue is creating a lot of stress for newer families, something CGM is supposed to alleviate. I love CGM. I'll say that again. I love CGM. It's an incredible tool, but you must know how to use it. If you're reading this book, you likely remember those confusing first days or weeks after diagnosis. Some say it's like drinking from a fire hose. I say it's like trying to drink from an ocean. There's just so much information. To then have your child wear a CGM and share numbers immediately can go smoothly for some, but it can be very confusing and overwhelming for others. I've looked at a lot of studies around parenting and CGM use, and there doesn't seem to be a consensus. Some show an increase in the parent's anxiety. Others show that goes down. Another shows more family tension after starting CGM, especially in parents of teens with type 1. One study in the American Diabetes Association's journal Diabetes caught my eye. Quote, "In summary, while not reaching statistical significance, results suggest that caregivers have different reasons for starting CGM in their children, which may be found to be related to their emotional state." End quote. In other words, parents of children with type 1 are individuals with different needs, expectations, and parenting styles. So rather than tell you what I think you should do and how you should share, I'd like to pose some questions that may help you figure out what works best for your family. Please keep in mind, I am not debating whether your child should wear a CGM. This is about using remote monitoring to help your child with diabetes management while also strengthening your relationship for the long term. I promise we don't have to sacrifice communication and empathy for a little bit more time and range. First question, why do I want to remote monitor? This sounds like a dumb question, right? Why wouldn't you want to see your child's blood glucose numbers? But I'd like you to think specifically about what might change in your family's diabetes management. Is there a problem you're trying to solve, or a particular situation you want to troubleshoot? It's hard to imagine how different it would have been to have used a CGM with a share capability when Benny was first diagnosed. How would I have answered this question? Well, when he was a toddler, I'd have said to help other caregivers as needed. We were lucky to have an amazing daycare and babysitters, but seeing the numbers would have made some of those phone calls easier. I think it would have also been helpful to avoid some lows. Toddlers are very unpredictable and can drop fast. It would have been nice to have a warning at 70 before we noticed Benny looking woozy and before we checked to find he was much lower. Never any emergencies, but we had quite a few lows under 55 before starting CGM. In elementary school, I would have said we wanted it to help him during sports, after school at friends' homes, and to help us all sleep better. That last one is tricky, though. Some studies show children get more sleep with CGM, but parents get less. That makes sense to me. I can only imagine how many highs and lows we slept through before CGM. But waking up to every single slightly out of range number isn't healthy either. We talked to our endo to come up with a range that kept Benny safe and allowed me to get some rest. There is nothing wrong with increasing the threshold of a high alarm on a night when the parent is exhausted. Your health matters too. Using an AID system has completely changed our overnights. But how you will manage sleep and diabetes management is still worth thinking about before starting any remote monitoring system. Here's another question. Who else will get access to my child's numbers? This is a tricky one, and I'd urge you to think through sharing with everyone who cares for your child. We shared with my mother for a few years. While we were visiting in Florida, we went away for an overnight and she watched the kids. It made sense to add her as a follower to Benny, but we forgot to remove her when we returned home. She lives over 600 miles away. The next time that urgent low blared in the middle of the night, guess who called me? We set some rules, more on that, and she stayed as a follower until a few years later. What about school staff? Well, this is a very personal decision, and I'd be careful about rushing into it. Most teachers and nurses are excellent about this, and I understand having people in the building knowing your child's glucose numbers all day long may give you more peace of mind. But I have heard many stories about staff that overreacts, pulling kids from class for every alarm, or even worse, being judgmental about highs and lows. I think it would be difficult to take away the follow power from a school nurse or helper, so be sure that's something you want to start. We've never shared with school for several reasons. The first year it would have been practical was 6th grade, the first year of middle school. Benny was just starting to get more independent with diabetes management and didn't want anyone looking over his shoulder. We agreed it wasn't necessary, but reserved the right to revisit. We've never changed our minds. If you share with anyone, I think it's worth at least a conversation about expectations and communication before you start. My third question for you, what does my child think about it? No matter the age, I'm a big fan of talking to our kids about these decisions. Even in middle school, when almost any conversation would cause an automatic eye roll and a whatever, just knowing that I cared enough to ask made a difference. Benny would almost always tell me what was on his mind. Even if it was 2 days later in the car or just before bed, he knew I would listen. Of course, this depends on age. For a younger child, I think it's a good idea to explain who can see their numbers and why. We got great advice early on to avoid phrases like, so we can keep you safe, but say instead, so you can feel good and play. We didn't want to teach Benny to fear diabetes, especially when he was a toddler. For elementary school children, I think it's a good idea to have a conversation with them and their healthcare team together, if you can. At the very least, decide as a family how you'll share at school and with whom. Then, present that plan to the school. That way your child is on board and knows the expectations. If your child tells you they don't want to share at school or with other caregivers, encourage them to talk to you about why. Is there one staff member who's a little too overreactive? Or are they embarrassed by beeping or interruptions? There are lots of ways to manage at school that can be a little bit more low-key. Going back to only looking at Dexcom numbers at certain times of day, raising the alarms just a little bit, ask your endo, and encouraging staff to let your child lead are a few ways to help shy kids feel more comfortable. My next question is, what are your family's rules of engagement? What's the plan for when the CGM alarm goes off? Talking through the possibilities has been a tremendous help for us. As Benny got older, we talked about what range he'd set on the CGM and what range I would set on my side. His range was a bit tighter. After all, he was the one responsible for taking action. My high alarm was set higher, and my low was set a bit lower. I love that CGMs give you the options to customize alarms. Here's what we agreed to for middle school. If Benny was very high, let's say above 300, I would text him after 30 minutes. In my mind, that's more than enough time to troubleshoot and treat. If he was above 200 for more than an hour, I would do the same. If he was below 80, but higher than 60, for more than half an hour, same thing. And the same if he was below 60 for 15 minutes. To us, that seemed reasonable for a child who'd been living with diabetes for 10 years and was already relatively independent. What about his side of things? Our 504 plan indicated he could text me anytime, but middle school is busy and there's a lot going on. I didn't want to overload him. So we agreed that for high blood glucose, as long as I saw the arrow turn in the time I mentioned in the previous paragraph, he didn't have to text back at all. For the lows, he had 15 minutes to get back to me. All he had to do was text, "I'm on it," or "treat it." If I didn't get that quick text back within the times we'd agreed to, and I didn't see the numbers change, I would call the school. If I still couldn't reach him, I promised I would drive to school and yell out the window, "My baby! My baby!" This is a fantastic threat I have used with both children if texts go unanswered, diabetes or not. I'm proud to say I never had to do it. I promise I would have. Maybe I'll do it just one time before Benny graduates. For younger or newly diagnosed children, you might decide on different parameters. I would likely have communicated sooner and within a tighter range during elementary school. But too tight a range can cause issues as well. I had a friend who would check her son's CGM values all day long during school and would text several times a day if his blood glucose was high. Here's the problem with that. Insulin is slow, and it lasts a lot longer in the body than most people think. How long is a school day? If your child is correcting 3 times a day and bolusing for all the carbs, that can create a low situation just when it's time to get on the school bus home. It happened to us quite a few times before we caught on. Another tough fact about remote monitoring is remembering that a CGM is about 15 minutes behind the actual blood glucose. It can also be slower to catch up when coming down from highs or going up from lows. I've shared some of our ranges here, and I know by doing so, I'm opening myself up to criticism. That's fine. I don't think the exact numbers and ranges are the point. It's about making a plan and following it. I promise you, it wasn't easy to keep from texting Benny for every high and low, especially that first year of middle school. But if I'd done that, I don't think we'd have the open and honest relationship we have today. This system works for me and Benny, and I'm confident it's been the right way for us to go about it. After nearly 16 years of diabetes, I have a happy and healthy kid who's independent but still wants to spend time with me. I've prioritized our relationship over perfect blood sugars, and I'm happy with that decision. In Benny's final year of high school, I have turned off all Dexcom alerts except urgent low, and he's now 100% independent in terms of day-to-day care. It's what we've been working for all this time. It's great. And also, I hate it. My last question for you: what will I do when technology fails? We have been very fortunate that Dexcom sensors work well for Benny. In the 4+ years we've used the G6, I'd say we get the full 10 days at least 90% of the time, with great accuracy. There was one time when we had a day full of failure, and of course, it was when I was heading out of town. In October 2019, I was excited about attending the first ever She Podcasts conference. The morning I was set to leave, Benny had no school and was due for a sensor change. As I was packing up the last of my things, he yelled, "Mom, the sensor failed." It had conked out during the warm-up. He was already getting another sensor ready, so I started loading up my car. That sensor failed too. Because the Dexcom reads values every 5 minutes, we had always been told to wait at least that amount of time between sensor changes to make sure the transmitter knows we're starting a new sensor and not trying to reuse the old one. We waited a good 20 minutes and then tried another sensor. No go. Amazingly, I had 2 sensors left. We rarely have this much of a stockpile. I didn't want to risk it. We so rarely have sensor issues, I assumed something was wrong with the transmitter. I called Dexcom. They transferred me to Tandem to troubleshoot. The person I spoke with was terrific and thorough and walked us through a bunch of troubleshooting steps. I, however, was getting impatient. I was supposed to be on the road already. Under her instruction, we put in a 4th sensor and I got ready to head out. I told Benny to call me and let me know the status and that I would continue the conversation on the road with Tandem if need be. Benny was 14 at the time and just wanted to be left alone to enjoy his day off from school. My husband would be home later that day, so I got in the car and left for Atlanta. That 4th sensor failed as well. My husband has type 2 diabetes and occasionally uses the Libre CGM. Benny decided he'd rather wear that than finger stick, which was fine by me. I spent more time on the phone with Tandem while I drove to my conference. We decided it was likely a transmitter issue, and they agreed to send replacements. Benny wore the Libre for the rest of that week. At the time, it didn't have a remote monitoring function. After we received the new transmitter and sensor replacement, the Dexcom issue was resolved. It was a frustrating experience, especially when I was away from home, but being without share and follow for a week didn't change our plans. School, sports, social stuff, Benny did it all. Even if we didn't have the Libre, he would have done finger sticks. Not ideal, but doable. Sometimes the issue is system-wide. A few years ago, on New Year's Eve, there was an issue with Dexcom Share. The user's phone or receiver was working fine. However, the Follow app didn't work. It was a complete fiasco. The mainstream media coverage and social media commentary about this matter went on for weeks. While I think Dexcom could have handled the situation better, especially in terms of communication, it saddened me to see so many parents react with panic and alarm. I am sure I would have felt the same if we hadn't spent so much time feeling safe and happy without CGM. But servers can fail, sensors will fall off, and companies will sometimes not send enough supplies. To me, it's important to be prepared. Make sure you have a working blood glucose meter and you know how to use it. Talk to your endo about how many times you might check blood glucose with a meter and create a backup plan. That way, if the CGM or just the Share goes down, you'll be better prepared. And finally, what if my child doesn't want to wear it? I once had an argument with another parent about letting our kids choose their technology. He told me that I wouldn't let my child say no to a cast if they broke their arm, or to chemotherapy if they had cancer, so why would I allow them to ever be without a CGM? I strongly disagree with this way of thinking. Let me say one more time, I love CGM. But people with diabetes have very few choices. They must put insulin in their body, and they must measure blood glucose. No choice for those 2 tasks. But in my opinion, how those tasks are accomplished is up to the person with diabetes. And yes, a child can make those body autonomy decisions. Of course, age and other factors come into play here. I didn't ask 2-year-old Benny if he wanted an insulin pump, but I let 8-year-old Benny decide about his CGM. As a parent, You make the rules in your house, and ultimately these decisions are up to you. But I urge you to present all diabetes technology as options and not edicts. I am not above rewarding or offering incentives, also known as bribes, for trying a CGM. Give it 2 weeks or a month, and here's a Lego set or a shopping trip. In my experience, a CGM makes so many things easier that most children with diabetes prefer using it over having multiple finger sticks every day. As long as their endo believes they are safe and healthy, forcing any technology can backfire in the long run. And I stand by my opinion that a CGM is not the same as chemotherapy. Here's another question. How can I stop staring at the numbers? Once you get Share, it is tough to stop looking at the numbers. We've had it for nearly 9 years, and I still struggle with this. It's controversial, though, to even mention this might be a problem. I know people who have their child's blood glucose numbers on display on screens all over their homes. This is all so new that there aren't any studies, but I can't imagine we're going to find out that seeing blood glucose numbers in our face around the clock is going to make a meaningful difference to diabetes management, and it may even be harmful in some unexpected ways. If you're just starting out with Share, you may decide to look at it only at certain times of the day. The alarms will let you know when you or your child will need to take action. And once you do, keep in mind insulin can be slow and CGM can lag behind, especially to reflect rising blood glucose after lows. That means there's no use checking every 5 minutes to see if a high is coming down or checking every minute to confirm a low is under control. You can also move the Follow app to a different screen on your phone. I moved mine off the home page ages ago. If you're using screens or other tools in very visible places, consider your child's age and stage. It might be great when they're 3 and you're trying to stay on top of volatile blood glucose while also caring for a child who needs your help with everything. But it may not be as effective for your 11-year-old who really doesn't want such a visible reminder of diabetes everywhere they look. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't use or rely on the CGM information, but there is a difference between using a tool like this to help our children thrive and letting it consume our thoughts to where if we can't see the numbers for even 15 minutes, panic sets in. Diabetes technology should make our lives easier, not add another layer of stress. And finally, what's next? When Benny started with a CGM in 2013, there were about 60,000 people using a Dexcom worldwide, according to the company. In 2022, it's estimated that more than 4.5 million people around the world are using a Dexcom Libre or Medtronic CGM. This technology isn't going anywhere, and use will continue to grow. It's amazing to me to look back and remember that we routinely did 8 to 10 finger sticks a day, every day, and more on sick days or when things were wonky. By the time Benny was 9 and started on CGM, his fingertips looked horrible. When they got wet, you could really see all the pinpricks. Even dry, they were pitted and marked up. It's amazing to me that now his fingertips are smooth and clear. I never imagined that would happen. What a joy! I'm thrilled with Control IQ, and if we ever figure out the access and affordability issue, AID systems and remote monitoring are going to become standard care. Even so, I still think it's about more than numbers and time and range. Taking a few minutes to think this through and communicate with your child will help with more than diabetes management. It will help your relationship and your peace of mind. Ask your doctor, are there conversations you suggest we have before we start remote monitoring? Do you think it's time to revisit our CGM monitoring routine now that my child is older than when we started? What should we know in case the CGM technology fails?
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
All right, it is contest time. Yes, if you've listened through all the way here, you get first crack at this contest. I'm giving away 2 copies of both books, and I'm also giving away a prize for sharing about it. But first, let me just say thank you for listening to that excerpt. I'd love to know what you think. I'd love to know what you think of the book overall. If you're reading it, if you've gifted it to somebody else, if you're waiting for the audio book, I'd love to know what you think. I'm really proud of Still the World's Worst Diabetes Mom, but I'm also a little nervous as well because, as you heard, there are some thoughts and ideas in this chapter alone that kind of go against the grain of a lot of current diabetes parenting styles. So we'll see. All right, here is the contest. Please share this episode on your Facebook or Instagram feed and tag me. You can tag Stacey Sims or the Diabetes Connections page. On Instagram, it's just Stacey Sims, so that might make it easier. You can share a link from the Diabetes Connections homepage, or you can share the link from whatever podcast app in which you are listening. Most of them have very easy ways to share. I don't care where the link comes from, as long as people can hear this episode. I know many of you are not parents, but most of you are very connected within the diabetes community. So I would love your help to reach more people who really could use some help, some advice, and some, ways to think these things through. There are 3 potential prizes for everyone who shares. I am giving away 2 copies of both books, so 2 people will each get 2 books. And then the third prize is a $25 gift card for Amazon, just for sharing the link and tagging me. You have to tag me so I know you did it. We will close off the contest on November 14th at midnight Eastern Time, and I'll announce the winners shortly after that. But if you post anytime between now, November 14th at midnight Eastern Time, and tag me, that would be fabulous, and I will include you in the drawing for those prizes. We are back with a newscast this Friday. Of course, there's a lot going on. It's Diabetes Awareness Month, which really just means we're wading through a lot of news that isn't exactly pertaining perhaps to this community, but we do our best. You would not believe the emails that I get this month, or maybe you do, about all the stories PR professionals, and I love most of you, are pitching. Some of them are bananas. I will share some of the more wild ones I get. I'll keep track this month and I'll let you know. Thanks as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions, who, by the way, is editing the audio book as well. So thank you so much, John. Thank you so much for listening and for all of your support. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here in a couple of days. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.